For Vaughan-Woodbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's great to speak tonight on such an important bill. I wish to say hello to all the viewers at home tonight that are paying attention attentively to what we are debating and doing the good work of all Canadians and what Canadians sent us to do here. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise to speak to the second reading of Bill C-24, an act to update and modernize the Salaries Act. I would like to emphasize a few points made by my colleagues who have spoken before me. They bear repeating, Mr. Speaker. The bill will update the Salaries Act to reflect the structure of the current ministry by adding 5 titled positions. It just makes good administrative sense that let the legislative framework should reflect the operating reality. The 5 positions to be added to the Salaries Act are already occupied by ministers who are working on the important priorities for this government and for Canadians in science, small business and tourism, status of women, la francophonie, sport, and persons with disabilities. The amendments formally recognize, Mr. Speaker, that these are full ministers with equal status around the cabinet table. I think something we should all be applauding. Mr. Speaker, I wish to focus on the status of women portfolio because I think our party and our government under the Prime Minister has much to be proud of. Yes, I am a feminist as well, as my Prime Minister states. On our recent trip to Italy, I was proud to hear our Prime Minister speaking to the Italian deputies and speaking to the important role about having a gender-balanced cabinet, having young women be proud in their government and look for opportunities when they go through school. Our government believes in putting an agenda forward that it has gender equality. If we look at the policies we have adopted in terms of the Canada Child Benefit, which removes approximately 40% of children out of poverty, which helps single mothers, that is something we need to be proud of. If we look at our recent EI changes, Employment Insurance changes, and the Budget Implementation Act, which gives women a choice to extend, or men, to extend their pat leave from 12 months to 18 months, flexibility. If we look at the Canada Caregiver tax benefit, where we amalgamated 3 tax measures, again, family-friendly. And for the most part, we know that women do a lot of the work at home, and they take care of their loved ones. We know that. Those are facts. And we have put forward an agenda that reflects that. Again, when I was in Italy with the Prime Minister, his comments to the Italian deputies and the trade delegation on the importance, I knew and I saw the reactions from the Speaker of the House in Italy, Laura Baldrini, how happy she was and how they commented about there's a Prime Minister in this world standing up for women and putting gender equality first. Mr. Speaker, I have 2 daughters at home, and I'm proud to say I look at their future and I say they have a wonderful future ahead because they have a government that's paying attention to their needs, to all Canadians' needs. And I think that's something that the opposition party can learn from. Mr. Speaker, our investment in childcare, our funds that we've set aside and our work that we're doing with the provinces, again, groundbreaking and again, helpful for working moms. We need to get that labour force participation rate up for women at home who wish to enter the labour force and give them that flexibility and that choice. That's good for the economy, and that's good for Canada, and that's good for our future. Mr. Speaker, on infrastructure, the Bill C-24 formalizes the naming of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Community. You know, one of the things we ran for on our platform was to invest in Canada and invest in Canadians through infrastructure. I'm proud to state that we're investing over $180 billion over 12 years, Mr. Speaker, something that we can be proud of, something that's growing our economy. And you look at our jobs numbers that have come out in the last 7-8 months. Look at our growth rates, which have easily surpassed the last 10 years of the Harper government when they were in power. Look at the jobs numbers. We're leading the G7 in job growth. We're leading the G7 in GDP growth. Our unemployment rate has fallen, something to be proud of, almost a full percentage point. It was 7 and change. Now it's down in the 6% range. Again, something to be proud of. In the city I call home, the city of Vaughan, in my riding of Vaughan-Woodbridge, we're going to be getting a wonderful subway, again, through investments in infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. And our GO Transit system in Ontario, again, the Prime Minister was in Etobicoke 2 or 3 months ago, investing a $2 billion investment in GO Transit. Again, getting people home quicker after work, getting them home to their kids' soccer game, their kids' hockey game, to their piano lessons. Those are the priorities of our government, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud to be part of that government. That is why Canadians elected us. That is why Canadians sent us here and gave us the mandate to invest in Canada and Canadians from coast to coast to coast. That is something that I'm very, very proud of, Mr. Speaker. I think about the announcements we've made on clean water, wastewater funds in York Region, where I was proud to stand with my York Region colleagues. Just 2 or 3 weeks ago, we put over $50 million in projects in York Region in water and wastewater treatment facilities, so Canadians can be assured, and people in York Region can be assured, that their infrastructure is up to date, it's modern, that we have clean drinking water for our families. Those are investments that pay off today and pay off tomorrow and for the years to come. That is something that we need to be proud of, Mr. Speaker. On the infrastructure side, investing in buses, regional transit, our ports, services.
Member for Calgary-Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're listening carefully to the member's speech, and I failed to see how any of that infrastructure spending is related to the Salaries Act debate we're having right now on ministerial pay. And if I could just have the member perhaps return to that subject matter. I've been trying to figure out how it's connected. So, Mr. Speaker, I just leave it to you to determine whether it's still relevant.
The Honourable Government House Leader has something to respond to this.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it is definitely relevant. Within the legislation, there's a change in the ministries. One of the changes is it establishes a Minister of Infrastructure. And I would suggest to you any topic related to infrastructure.
I believe we're moving into the area of debate. As I've said before, when the Speaker is up here, you hear stories and you often hear things said that you wonder how they're going to be relevant or wonder where they're going. But there's 338 members in this House who I believe that their constituency have put them here to speak about their constituency and represent them. How they represent them, I will leave them up to them, and hopefully they'll bring it back and it will be relevant. I have a lot of hope in all these 337 members, other than myself, and I'm sure it'll all work out. So I'll let the honourable member continue, and I'll keep an ear open. I want to thank the honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
Thank you.
The honourable member for.
Look at the name of Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. Isn't the irony communities? Because that's what Canada is made up of. Communities from coast to coast to coast, and that's what we're doing, and that's what our minister is doing, and I'm proud to stand beside him in this House to invest in Canada and Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Again, on the status of women, I just go back. Chapter 5, we've created an equal tier of all ministries. Chapter 5 of our budget, for the first time, and this is why status of women is important to be a full portfolio, which it is, and which it is, of course. Chapter 5, a gender-based analysis, gender-based view in our budget for the first time ever. I think women make up 52% of our population or something like that, and it's our government that put forward this agenda, a feminist agenda, to ensure that women are participating in the labour force, Mr. Speaker. Small business and tourism. Tourism, the numbers are going very, very well for Canada. We are attracting more and more tourists. People around the world, you hear that. You travel the world, and they'll tell you, we want to come visit Canada. We want to see what you're doing there. We like it. We like the direction this government is going. Again, a full ministry. Very much so. Small businesses, SMEs as I like to call them. In my wonderful riding of Vaughan-Woodbridge, small businesses are the driver of economic growth. They employ thousands of people in Vaughan, thousands of people in York Region, and we need that focus on small business. And the one thing we've done is when we cut taxes for the middle class and we raised them 1%, we created aggregate demand. So people felt better about themselves, felt better about their future, became more optimistic, and they went and spent, and they went and invested in their families, in their regions, in their communities. So yes, a full ministry for small business and tourism. Tourism continues to be an economic driver for Canada. We need to do more. We will do more. We are investing in our marketing agencies and so forth. So when I look at these changes, these 5 title changes and what's in the Salaries Act, I say to myself, we are going the right direction. Our focus on status of women, on small business and tourism is exactly the direction we need to go in as a government, and I'm proud to be part of that government. These updating exercises are not new, Mr. Speaker. The list of Salary Act ministers has been amended several times in the last decade, most recently in 2013. In each case, the changes align with the priorities of the times and with the Prime Minister's preferences with respect to the composition of his ministry and the organization of the government administration. The bill will also modernize the Salaries Act by introducing a measure of flexibility to cabinet making going forward. It does that by adding 3 untitled ministerial positions. These positions will provide room for Prime Ministers at a future time to appoint entitled ministers to reflect and respond to the changing priorities of their day. To me, that's smart planning. I worked in the private sector for 25 years. The world is evolving. A lot of global uncertainty. Things are evolving at home. We want to make sure the government has flexibility to introduce ministers or ministries as they see fit and to respond to changing circumstances. Makes sense to me. That's what we would do in the private sector. I like that, and we bring it here to government. Members on the other side have asked what the Prime Minister's plans are for these cabinet posts. Why are they needed? Why are they not named? To that, I would say that this change looks to the future. It builds in a degree of flexibility in the structuring of future ministries to reflect the priorities of the day. This is a government that looks to the future and that values adaptability to change in big ways and smalls. This is small, but in an important way, Mr. Speaker. It will enable a modern, adaptable ministry well into the future. There are safeguards too, Mr. Speaker. This bill does not enable the installation of an oversized cabinet, and we all know what that looks like from the past administration. The proposed increase in the number of Salaries Act positions will be offset by the removal of 6 regional development positions. The maximum number of ministers that may be appointed under the Salaries Act, including the Prime Minister, will increase by 2 positions, from 35 to 37. I've heard the comments from the members of this House on the removal of the regional development positions. To them, I would like to emphasize, Mr. Speaker, that removing these positions from the Salaries Act in no way affects the status of the regional development agencies themselves. Let me re-emphasize that point. FedDev, Alcoa, the regional development ministries continue to operate, continue to do a great job for the regions they represent. They continue to invest in Canadians from coast to coast to coast. You know what, Mr. Speaker, I grew up in a small town in northern British Columbia. I understand what it means to come from a region where the next town is 2 hours away, or 144 kilometers, if I remember correctly, and you feel like you're far away from a big city, whether it's Vancouver or Toronto, and you're there, and you want to make sure your voice is being heard, and you want to make sure there are investments taking place in your area of the country. And, Mr. Speaker, this Salaries Act does not change the prerogative or the role of the regional development agencies. It is misleading to suggest otherwise. The regional development agencies will continue to be a vital part of this government's economic development work and will be overseen by a minister. Regions are not being ignored under this government. Accountability is not being ignored under this government. These administrative amendments to the Salaries Act change none of that. Finally, I would like to correct a misconception about this bill that has been asserted in this place. It has been suggested that its effect is merely to authorize a raise for the 5 ministers who are appointed by the Ordering Council on November 4th, 2015, as ministers of state to assist other ministers, and that those Ordering Council make it clear that these are junior ministers subordinate to other ministers and therefore not deserving of the same salary. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. To those comments, let me say first that all ministers have been paid the same salary since day one. Equal pay for equal work. That is what we believe in, Mr. Speaker. This bill does not change that. There is no raise for any minister under this bill. Then let me say that I believe our government has been clear in explaining that the legislative framework in place on November 4th, 2015 prevented the appointment of full ministers to these 5 positions. Use of the Ministries and Ministers of State Act allowed ministers to be appointed to those positions and to get to work on the priorities of this government and Canadians on day one. The Prime Minister committed to introducing legislation that would formally equalize the status of all members of his ministry. Promise made and promise kept, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to be part of a government that keeps its promises to Canadians, that's investing in Canadians, and we see that handsomely in the recent months with our economy growing at a rate of over 2.5%, which had never been achieved under the Conservatives, or which had not been achieved under the Conservatives, from my understanding. We see job growth taking unemployment rate down, Mr. Speaker, to the 6.2% range. We see income growth. We see exports rebounding. We see business investment starting to show green shoots. All things that we can be proud of as a government, Mr. Speaker. And when the full ramp-up of infrastructure spending takes place, which it will, and it is, we'll see further gains in employment numbers across the country, coast to coast to coast. This bill fulfills this commitment. When it comes into force, the orders in council that appoint these ministers as ministers of state to assist other ministers will be repealed. They will be in law, as they are in practice, full and equal ministers. In closing, Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left? Great, thank you. In closing, Mr. Speaker, let me repeat what I said at the beginning of my remarks. The Salaries Act amendments are administrative in nature. It makes good sense to update and modernize the legislation to reflect the structure of the current ministry and to enable flexible and adaptable ministries now and in the future. I hope all members will join me in supporting this bill. Mr. Speaker, when we look at our government's agenda, including Bill C-24, Canadians sent us here to do the good work that they wanted us to, and what we told them we do so in our platform. And we fulfilled many of those promises, Mr. Speaker. And I looked at Canada Child Benefit, our middle-class tax cut, and our investments in infrastructure. And I say to myself, where are we taking Canada? And I look at these changes in C-24, where we appoint full ministers to status of women, the Francophone, small business and tourism, especially with my finance background. And it tells me our government is taking Canada to a place where we need to go. We're not only passing the puck, we're going to where the puck is going to, if I made that analogy correctly from our ice hockey days. We are going to score the goal, and we're going to continue scoring the goals. And for me, scoring the goals is making sure and ensuring Canadians have a brighter future, that that Canadians find the job that they're looking for, that they come home to their families quicker in the evening, and that we continue to invest in them. And that's our mandate of our government. Frankly, for me, is to ensure that my two daughters who visited Parliament here yesterday, Eliane and Natalia, have a bright future. There's nothing more important for myself and for my family when this privilege may end, and it's not going to end for a long time, I tell you, that they have a bright future ahead of them. Mr. Speaker, I'll close my remarks off there, and I look forward to answering any of the questions from my humble colleagues.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de
The honourable member for Hochelaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member started by talking about programs for women. I'd like to talk about real stuff, such as a low-cost childcare service. That would really help women. It would help them get back to work and would balance out women's chances to get a better salary on the labour force. We don't have any bill like that on the table. So rather than have this fake bill like this, why not bring forth a real bill that would truly help women, like low-cost childcare?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Hochelaga for the question. Our investments in Canadians and in our investments in Canadian families, and specifically women, to me are groundbreaking. If you look at the Canada Child Benefit, which increases benefits for 9 out of every 10 families, an average of $2,300 a year more than what they were receiving. Incredible. If you look at our investment in childcare, which is approximately $500 million a year, creating about, I think it's 40,000 annual spaces in childcare for the most, frankly, the most low income folks and middle income folks that really need childcare, that really need the help. We are working with the provinces, we are working with Canadians, we are working with women groups, and we're listening. And those investments, just two, and I can name off another 5 or 6, are two that are going to make a difference in families' lives from coast to coast to coast. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments. The honourable member for La Salle-et-Mar-Verdun.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for his speech. He touched on some interesting points, and as Parliamentary Secretary for Innovation, Science and Economic Development, I see the impact firsthand of removing the old ministers of state for the regional development agencies. And I echo his comments about the fact that we have created a much more lean and efficient ministry and department, and that the departmental functions of each of the regional economic development agencies has in fact not been impaired, but I would argue improved with standardized practices. And I would just invite the honourable member to elaborate on the fact that this is reflecting a reality in good governance, making government more efficient and making the regional development agencies more effective.
The honourable member for Vaughan-Woodbridge.
I thank the Parliamentary Secretary and member from La Salle-Verdun for his question. About 2 or 3 months ago, I was able to make an announcement in York Region where FedDev provided I believe it was a $3 or $3.5 million repayable loan to a commercial aircraft part supplier. High-skilled jobs that paid well north of $100,000 a year. And we made that announcement, and I thought, FedDev, we are making an announcement in a manufacturer that is providing good quality jobs in York Region, that is competing against companies globally, and those type of investments are the investments we need to grow the economy. We need to grow key sectors. In this instance, it was the aerospace sector, and it was something I was proud of. I spoke to the owner that morning, and he thanked us for being partners with his company. He thanked us for that repayable loan, or if you want to call it a grant, but it was a repayable loan. And I said, you know, I remember this conversation vividly. I said, we are investing in high tech, in high margin industries, in industries where we see growth. And here was a company in York Region manufacturing parts for the Boeing 787 and the Airbus 330 and 320, and something we can be proud of. And that was provided by FedDev. And I agree full-heartedly on governance. I come from the private sector. Governance is very important for me. I wouldn't invest in a company if they didn't have good governance, and I wouldn't believe in government if we didn't have good governance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, the honourable member for Calgary Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for his contributions to the debate so far. I know we've had lots of conversations about the Kurdish issue and the Parliamentary Friends of the Kurds group that we were on together. But what I want to ask him about is these late sittings that we've had. We're considering C-24, which is a bill that was introduced pretty much a year ago. And this is really the urgent matter that the government wanted to have debated in evening sittings, a salary increase for Liberal cabinet ministers. We could pretty much retitle this the pay raise for Liberal cabinet ministers. So why is this such a critical, important issue for the government when we could be debating lowering taxes on small business, actually getting control of the budget and reducing the deficit down to zero, actually following through on infrastructure, completion of projects instead of just announcements and more press releases. So I asked the member, why are we having late sittings to debate Liberal cabinet pay increases?
The honourable member for Vaughan-Woodbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend for that question. I will say I do want to correct something. Bill C-24 does not increase and does not result in any new spending or any new salaries. The salaries were effective the date that these ministers were appointed, so the salaries are unchanged. There is no new incremental or no new spending in place with this thing. So I do wish to correct that. I think my friend had mentioned that. So I do wish to correct the record on that because he is incorrect actually. What I will say is our government. Well, I'm here to work. I was sent here by my residents to work, frankly, and if I have to stay here till midnight every night to work for their priorities, I'll be here. That's what we get paid for. We get paid for by the taxes that our constituents and Canadians pay, and I'll be here every night to work till midnight if I have to get the good work done of all the voters across Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to, I know there's a lot of people watching here tonight, and I just want to say to all the Canadian daughters that are being spoken of very proudly by the fathers, and rightfully so. I'm a proud daughter who learned from my father not to get schmoozed and to not worry about the names you might be called if you're smart or assertive and you're applying your critical thinking to some of the things that people say. So I would say to these same daughters who are watching tonight to think about this, and maybe here's a couple questions and maybe the honourable member would like to answer them. So does this mean that these ministers of state are now going to have power and responsibility equal to the ministers as under the definition of the House of Commons Procedure and Affairs and Practices? Does this mean they're going to get ministries of state now? Does this mean that we're so serious about gender equality now that we're going to implement this legislation that's been committed to? Does this mean that people who are taking on roles and responsibilities in senior positions are going to be equally men and women? Does this mean that the word feminism is more than just a charade? What exactly does a minister of state do equal to the power of a minister of a department if they don't have a ministry?
The honourable member for Vaughan-Woodbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the question from the member from Windsor-Tecumseh. I will say that the responsibilities for each of these ministers is laid out in the mandates letter provided by the Prime Minister. And I look at the status of women ministry, and I think to myself, that's the right direction our government has to go in, and that's the right direction that all Canadians wish us to go in. We want to make sure, and for me personally, I want to make sure that labour force participation rates for women across the country increase up and match those of men. That's important. I want to see this globally as well. Women empowered, and that's very important for us. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
We have time for a very brief question. L'honorable député de Guelph.
The honourable member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think finally I'm starting to see agreement on both sides of the aisle, but that might be because our honourable member is from a different party than the other people on the other side of the aisle. We have been discussing issues of governance, and you mentioned your private sector experience. And right now we are talking about governance. Could you expand on the range of governance that we're now introducing with equal say around the table?
The honourable member for Vaughan-Woodbridge. Before he begins, I just want to remind the honourable members, I'm sure you meant the honourable member for Vaughan-Woodbridge, not my own personal experience. I just want to clarify that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend and colleague from the wonderful riding of Guelph, which I had the chance to visit a few times. I will say governance is very, very important, and transparency. And with this C-24, the first thing it does is it equalizes the ministers, and that's very, very important. Equal pay for equal work, and that's supremely important. And the responsibilities are laid out in the mandate letter by the Prime Minister, so there's full transparency there in what each minister is directed to do. And then there's also full accountability by the mandate letters, and that's also very important to myself, and very important to my voters back in the beautiful riding of Vaughan-Woodbridge, which I hope to visit soon enough and get back to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for